Hey everyone! Welcome to the Young and the Restless. I'm Jane, and I'm so excited to have you here. If you love Young and the Restless, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Alright, let's dive right in. Claire stood by the window, her fingers tracing the frame as she gazed out at the calm street below. The morning light filtered through the glass, creating a lovely glow on the weathered image she held in her other hand. Cole, smiling, carefree, frozen in time. The anguish in her chest was familiar, it had been with her since the day he was taken away. She could still hear his laughing and feel the warmth of his hand against hers, as if he were standing there next her. But the silence that followed was deafening, a terrible reminder of the emptiness he had left behind. Today marked 5 years since his death, and while the pain had lessened over time, it had never fully disappeared. She had promised herself she wouldn't spend the day drowning in grief. Cole would not have wanted that. Instead, she would commemorate him as he deserved, by celebrating his life rather than lamenting his death. She had spent the morning making his favorite meal, the aroma of pancakes and maple syrup filling the air, as it had on so many Sunday mornings when he was still alive. She placed a plate on the table for him, a modest, bittersweet gesture that made her smile despite her tears. Later, she'd returned to the park where they'd spent so many memories, where he'd proposed to her beneath the ancient oak tree, its branches reaching for the sky like a promise. She would sit on their bench, which was engraved with his name, and chat to him as if he were still there, telling him about her life, her hardships, and the small joys she'd discovered along the way. It was her way of keeping him close and ensuring that his memory would carry on in the smallest of ordinary occasions. She knew he was gone, but he would always be present in her heart, a guiding light in the darkness. Meanwhile, Mariah became stuck in a nightmare from which she could not escape. It had begun as a typical day, coffee, business emails, and the usual routine, but when the phone rang, everything changed. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in years, and it sent chills down her spine. That was him. The guy who had haunted her dreams, ruined her trust, and crushed her heart. She had tried to go on, to create a life for herself away from the anguish of her past, but everything came rushing back in an instant. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the edge of the counter, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The walls of her apartment appeared to shut in on her, the shadows stretching and twisting into shapes that reminded her of that night, the one she had worked so hard to forget. She could still feel his hands on her and hear the harsh things he murmured into her ear. She had convinced herself she was stronger now, that the past could no longer harm her, but the fear was paralyzing. She collapsed to the floor, her back against the cabinets, and tears flowed down her cheeks. She had no idea how to escape the memories or silence the voice in her head that warned her she would never be free. But, deep within the horror, a spark of defiance sparked. She had survived before and would survive again. She wouldn't let him win or steal anything else from her. She gradually forced herself to stand, take a big breath, and convince herself that she was no longer that terrified, helpless girl. She was stronger now, and no matter how much the past attempted to hold her back, she would keep moving forward. Danny, on the other hand, was full of nervous energy as he paced the length of his living room, his fingers playing with the small velvet box in his pocket. He'd been planning this moment for months, waiting for the right time, place, and words. But now that the day had arrived, he couldn't stop worrying that something might go wrong. What if she says no? What happens if he stumbles over his words? What if the ring isn't right? He had spent hours thinking about every detail, from the restaurant to the position he would take on one knee. He wanted it to be a remarkable experience, one they would both remember for the rest of their lives. He had even practiced his speech in front of the mirror, his reflection nodding appreciatively as he poured his heart out to an imaginary audience. But, as the time ticked closer to their dinner reservation, his confidence faded. He took a long breath, attempting to settle his racing heartbeat. He adored her, more than he had ever loved anyone, and that had to count for something. She had been his rock, his companion, and his greatest friend, and he couldn't imagine living without her. This wasn't just about the proposal, it was about the future they'd create together, the adventures they'd have, and the love that would see them through anything life threw at them. He checked his watch one final time, brushed out the wrinkles on his shirt, and collected the bouquet of flowers he'd picked up earlier. It was time. As he stepped outside into the evening air, the weight of the ring in his pocket felt less like a burden and more like a promise of eternity. Claire had spent the day in peaceful thought, making tiny, meaningful actions to keep Cole's spirit alive in her heart. She had gone to the park as arranged, and as she sat on the seat, she could almost feel his presence beside her. The wind rustled through the leaves, bringing only a faint whisper of his voice. She closed her eyes, allowing the sun's warmth to wash over her, and for a brief minute, she believed he was with her. She told him about the book she'd been reading, which he would have enjoyed, as well as the stray cat that had begun to visit her porch, a scruffy little creature that reminded her of the one they'd adopted together years ago. She laughed through her tears as she remembered their stupid disagreements and how he always persisted on putting too much salt on his food, no matter how many times she cautioned him. The sorrow of his absence was still present, intense and uncompromising, as was the love, a love that time could never erase. As the sun began to drop, she kissed her fingertips and softly pushed them against the etching of his name. "I miss you," she muttered, barely audible above the rustling foliage. "But I'll see you again someday." With one final glance at the bench, she turned and went away, her heart heavy but full. Mariah had spent the afternoon battling her own demons, the phone conversation playing over and over in her head. She had attempted to divert herself by turning on the TV, looking through her phone, and even getting lost in work, but the memory stuck to her like a second skin. It wasn't until her best friend arrived unexpectedly, a bottle of wine in one hand and a determined expression in her eyes, that she felt like she could breathe again. "You're not alone in this," her friend told her, pulling her into a tight hug. "You don't have to face it by yourself." Those comments had been a lifeline, a reminder that she had changed since then. She had people who loved her and would support her no matter what. As they sat on the couch, the wine relaxing the knots in her chest, she realized she hadn't talked about that night in years. The words came out fresh and unedited, and with each one, she felt lighter. It wasn't easy, and she knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She was not defined by what had happened to her, and she refused to let it govern her anymore. She would reclaim her power, one step at a time. Danny's worries had almost vanished when he noticed her strolling toward him in the restaurant, her smile lighting up the room. She was stunning, and he knew right away that no matter what happened, this was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. The dinner had been perfect, the conversation smooth and familiar, but as dessert arrived, his palms began to sweat. This was it. He took a big breath, reached for her hand, and before he could think twice, he was on one knee. The words came out, honest and genuine, and when her eyes welled up with tears, he realized he had nothing to fear. "Yes," she said softly, pulling him into a kiss as the restaurant erupted in applause around them. The ring fitted perfectly onto her finger, and as they clutched each other, Danny realized this was only the beginning of their greatest adventure. Claire, Mariah, and Danny, 3 lives, 3 stories linked by love, loss, and the promise of what lies ahead. Each of them experienced their own fights, times of uncertainty and dread, but they found the strength to persevere. Claire honored Cole's memory by living a life he would be proud of, Mariah confronted her past to recover her future, and Danny took the risk that would change his life forever. Their adventures were far from over, but in those moments, they had each discovered a way to progress, one step at a time.